I'm Brian Miller, magician and motivational speaker. If you're a regular subscriber, thanks so much for sticking with me, and if you're new here, welcome to the channel. So you've got a Canon M3 or some other camera that doesn't have slow motion options. In other words, it doesn't have the higher frame rates above 24 or 30 that you would need to slow down that footage in post and get that buttery, smooth B-roll like you see in Peter McKinnon's videos or Sarah Dici, or to a much less impressive extent, some of my videos. And you're thinking, man, I wish I could get that great B-roll, but I don't have slow motion. What do I do? Well, don't panic. In this video, I'm gonna show you how you can use the M3 or similar non-slow motion cameras to get beautiful cinematic B-roll for your vlogs. So first things first, we need to make sure that you have the right settings in your camera to get nice cinematic B-roll. First and foremost, you want to set your camera to 24 frames per second if that's an option for you. 24 frames per second is the cinematic standard. It's got the most natural motion blur to the human eye. If you have 24, set it to that. If you're planning on using B-roll in your vlogs at all, you should be shooting your entire vlog in 24 FPS. If you don't have 24, set it to 30, that's fine. Next, and you probably know this by now, but you're gonna use the 180-degree shutter rule, which means you set your shutter speed to twice your frames per second. So if you're using 24 frames per second, you wanna set your shutter to 1/50th. If you're using 30 frames per second, you wanna set your shutter to 1/60th. Set that manual, lock it down, that's it. Now there's one more thing you should be aware of if you're using a Canon camera, and if you're not using a Canon camera, you probably have a similar function to what I'm about to show you on your camera. You'll just need to figure out what it is. And that is, you want to be able to lock your exposure. On Canon cameras, there's this star function, which is right here. What the star function does on Canon cameras is that it locks your exposure settings. In other words, if you've got anything on auto, like your aperture or your ISO or both, so whenever the camera's pointed at something like it is right now, if I hit that star key, it'll automatically lock my exposure to exactly whatever the settings were at the moment when I hit the star key. Which means now, if you move the camera around, even if it gets into bad conditions where normally over here it would change the ISO because it's too bright, it's not going to. It's going to keep everything exactly what it was at the moment that I hit the star button. And the reason you want to be aware of that exposure lock is because when you're shooting B-roll, you don't want your camera adjusting the exposure mid-shot. If you're doing a nice pan across of a landscape or sweeping across of a room or something, you don't want your camera, if it hits a bright window, to suddenly adjust your exposure to make everything darker or vice versa. You want to have your settings steady through a shot. That's going to look much more cinematic. That's going to make for nicer B-roll. Anytime you're going to shoot B-roll with your camera, you get the camera set up, either you use the manual settings or you let your camera do its auto settings, and then you lock the exposure before you hit record. So here are a few non-technical tips for getting good B-roll. You want to use camera motion when your scene is still, and you want to keep your camera still when there's a lot of motion. This is not a hard rule. It's kind of just a general philosophy, but the idea is this. If let's say you're gonna get B-roll of like a house, right? And there's nothing moving in the scene. There's no wind, so the trees aren't rustling, and there's a house. Well, if you just leave your camera still pointed at the house, it's gonna look like a photo. It's not actually going to look like video. So in that situation, you would want to use some camera motion, pushing in or panning across or up and down, stuff that we're gonna talk about how to do in a little bit. You're gonna wanna use motion when there's a still scene. But if there's a lot of motion, like if you've got rushing water or a lot of people moving, generally you will accentuate the motion. You'll actually get more cinematic motion by keeping your camera still and letting the actual motion in the scene do the work for you. Look for interesting compositions. You want to look for places in your scene, wherever you're shooting the B-roll, that you're going to set up that have really nice compositions. Use your rule of thirds. Use your eye to figure out what would look really interesting in this shot. Shoot through the scenery. This is really, really cool. Whenever if you've got trees or leaves, or if you're inside and that and you're shooting and you're gonna take some B-roll of a room, you can shoot and kind of catch part of the wall in the shot. Okay, now for some technical tips. Whenever possible, have your camera on a tripod. Whether you're holding the tripod or you've actually got it sitting on the ground or on a surface, have your camera on a tripod. The tripod, most popular for YouTubers, of course, is the Joby Gorilla Pod, right? And the reason that this is so popular is because it has so many different functions. I can keep the legs pressed up against my body, and what that'll do is that'll give me a really nice stabilization. So I can do like a pan across, right? Apart from the noise of the chair squeaking right now, but here, watch. Ready? That looks pretty stable. What if I wanted to go up and down? Now, whether you've got it locked to your body or not, what you want to do is you don't want to have your arms way out here in front of you. That's going to be really shaky as you're trying to move because you don't have any stability here. You want to keep your arms tight to your body like this. That'll give you a much more stable grip. And whenever possible, get a good grip on the camera. I've got a grip here, so if you get a good solid grip, even though that this isn't pinned against my body right now, if I have a good solid grip, I can do a nice pan from up to down or left to right, and it's going to look pretty stable. Now you might notice that as I was doing that, I wasn't actually moving my arms down like this. If you just use your arms, even if you're locked, it can get a little wobbly. Instead, I positioned the camera and then I moved my entire body down to get a much more stable look. And that's the next big tip, is that when you're getting B-roll, when you're doing pan shots or up and down or anything like that, you want to lock your arms tight to your body, stabilize, and then use your body to turn instead of your arms. If I want to do a pan across from left to right, here's the way I would do it. I would actually turn towards the end position. Say that's where I want to end. I want to end over there, but I want to start over here. I turn all the way towards the end position, and then I rotate my body back this way. And then watch what happens when I just let my body go. That's a nice smooth turn from left to right because my body was naturally getting back to its original position. As opposed to if you're just trying to go from here, now you're pushing, right? When you actually turn your whole body like that, you're actually pushing the camera as opposed to letting your back or letting your body naturally move on its own. Now, you might notice that I have a lot of cool options because I'm using a really, really good ball head. This is the Joby 360 ball head that if you follow Casey Neistat, he talks a lot about how amazing this thing is. And let me tell you, I was using the standard Joby ball head that came with the GorillaPod for a long time. I only recently started using this, and it is incredible. You cannot believe how helpful this is for getting nice cinematic B-roll. One of the reasons that a ball head like this is really worth the investment, it's like 50 bucks. I know you gotta spend a little bit of money for this, so you don't need to do this, but if you're willing to do it, here's how beautiful it can be for you. You're gonna make sure that you get the camera level. Now, there's not a level on this ball head, okay? So I'm going to use the digital level within the camera itself. Everything's manual, the exposure lock's on, we're good. I'm going to loosen up the rotation, the 360 thing, which means that this can now rotate perfectly like this. I can just using a finger, I can push and get a really nice pan from left to right. And of course, this ball head is also what allows me to go completely 90 degrees, which is how, when I was stabilizing it against my body earlier, and of course I was flipping out the screen so that I could look straight down and see the screen while it was stabilized. Okay, so here's another technique for getting a kind of a push-in, which is, this is credit to Peter McKinnon. Peter McKinnon did this when he was doing a video about B-roll a while back. Let's say that I want to do a push-in to this right here. What I'm going to do is hold the camera, and then I'm going to literally fall forward. And at the last second, I'm going to stick my leg out in front of me and make sure that I don't actually hit anything. And there's like a 1 to 2 seconds there where the camera is in free fall towards whatever it is you're filming. And that means that there's absolutely no resistance from the camera itself while you're doing that shot, which looks really, really smooth. Then you can take that 1 to 2 seconds of free fall, cut that out in post, and add digital stabilization. Whether you're using Premiere or Final Cut or whatever you have, as long as you have a digital stabilization option, you can add that and it really smooths it out even without slow motion. So the next tip I have for you is to use longer focal lengths or to zoom if you have a zoom lens. So this is the wide 11 to 22 millimeter lens, the EFM 11 to 22. This is a really wide vlogging lens, which you can see right here. I've done lots of videos on all the lenses for the Canon M series. But this lens right here, you see how wide it is. This doesn't look very cinematic, this shot right now, right? But if I zoom in to all the way to 22, I get a much more cinematic field of view here. Or I can come back out to maybe 18, right about there. The wide shot doesn't look as cinematic because it's got that kind of distortion around the edges of the frame, right? Like over here, it's you can see the door is distorted, and that's not really cinematic, but you see that the distortion goes away once you get to about 18. You can now see that the edge of the frame is pretty straight with the door right there. If you have a longer zoom lens, like you have the 18 to 55 kit or the 18 to 150 or something like that, then you can really zoom in, and the further in you zoom, the more it compresses the image. You can get nicer blurry backgrounds, and there's just something about being further zoomed in that looks a little bit more cinematic. The one thing you have to be concerned with is if you're zoomed in pretty far, the further in you zoom, the more you want to make sure you're stabilized, you're on a tripod, you're locked in place. So one thing you can do is you can play with manual focus. You can have a lot of fun playing with manual focus. Okay, lastly, I know that this is an entire video about getting cinematic B-roll without slow motion, but the M3 actually does have a slow motion option. It has 60 frames per second at 720p. If you really want to use some slow-mo with the M3, you can go to 720p at 60 frames per second. You can film that, and then you can slow it down to 40% in post if you're editing at 24 frames per second, because 24 is 40% of 60. Now, I use that 40% slow-mo with all of my other cameras that shoot 1080p and 60 frames per second. That's what I'm always using. Everything slow-mo you see in my videos is 40% shot at 60 frames per second, edited in 24. I never shoot the 720p 60 frames per second in this camera, but you can do it. The thing is, you're gonna have to upscale in post from 720 to 1080. You're gonna lose some resolution. It's not gonna look quite as crisp, not quite as sharp. So if you do that, make sure that you add a little bit of digital sharpness in post to kind of bring it back a bit. Okay, well, I hope that this was helpful for you. I hope that you've got a sense of a lot of different techniques that you can use with the M3 or non-slow motion cameras to get some nice cinematic B-roll for your vlogs. Let me know if anything helped you out down there in the comments. If you've got questions of your own for future videos or about any of the techniques I just mentioned, please let me know down there. If there's some techniques that I didn't mention, I didn't think of, let us all know. We can all learn from each other. I appreciate the community that we're building here on this channel. As always, my name is Brian Miller. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and always remember that our world is a shared experience. Have a great day.